are strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to Thee. Just a closer walk with Thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to Thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Through this world of toil and snares, if I falter, Lord, who cares? Who with me my burden shares? None but Thee, dear Lord, none but Thee. Just a closer walk with Thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to Thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. When my feeble life is o'er, time for me will be no more. Guide me gently, safely o'er to Thy kingdom shore, to Thy shore. Just a closer walk with Thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to Thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, He'll prepare for us a place.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a sign.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Let us then be true and faithful, trusting, serving every day. Just one glimpse of Him in glory will the toils of life repay.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout.
All right. Chapter 7. Now when the Pharisees gathered to Him. Now we're going to stop right there. There's not a whole lot of time in this particular context that deals with describing who the Pharisees were and what the Pharisees were. What do we know from general study of the Bible what are these Pharisees? Okay, so they're religious folk. It is a sect among Judaism. What's a sect? Yeah, a subgroup. So they're Jewish, but they have a unique identity among themselves, which primarily rests in what? What do they believe about themselves? That they were the most righteous. What they definitely were, based upon what was written in the scriptures, and particularly Paul's description, is that they were the strictest among the sects of the Jews, which simply meant that they tried very hard to apply the law very strictly. And they did that to themselves. At one point, Jesus talks about the fact that they tithed, not just the kind of things that we might think of with a tithe, but they tithe mint and dill and cumin and all of these spices. That they applied the idea of giving a tenth to God to the, if you'll allow me to say it, to the nth degree on all of what they possessed and had. And so they were very strict about that. But at the same time, Jesus says, what about them? Despite the fact that they were careful to tithe their dill and their cumin and all these tiny little spices, despite the fact that they were doing that, what else did they do? They neglected the weightier matters of the law, which is why they're introduced here, I believe. Because as I said, this is kind of a contrast. This is carrying forward this idea of spiritual versus the flesh. And what the Pharisees did is they were very careful to focus on all of the physical aspects of service while they ignored what? Love and justice and mercy and all of those things that are abstract concepts that are carried out in the character of a man. Now, what is religion? What is Christianity? What is godliness supposed to change about a man? Primarily. Okay. Their beliefs about the nature of God and the person of his Son. What else? Okay, it is supposed to change your behavior, but why does it change your behavior? Because it changes your heart first. And that's the part of it that we tend to not pay attention to. As long as the outward behavior doesn't get us into trouble, then we think everything's okay. By the way, sometimes we don't think it gets us into trouble, but it really does. But that's another story too. But as long as nobody has anything that they can accuse us of, then we're okay, but that's just not true. It's great that I've never committed adultery with regard to my marital relationship, but Jesus actually taught what? That it starts even more fundamental than that the thing that I really have to do is what? Not lust after others. Whether I act on that lust or not, the lust itself is an issue. And so it's great that I've never been unfaithful to my spouse, but what about my heart? And we could list any number of things that way. It's great that I'm not overtly racist, but what about my heart? It's great that I attend the assembly of the church and I engage in the songs and the prayers and all those things, but what about my heart? And that's actually what this is dealing with. The Pharisees gathered to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem. Some places those scribes are referred to as lawyers. It's the same group of people. And what these are people they're specialists in the law. And if you had questions about the law, you would go to them. Now, we're not talking about, there wasn't a distinction between civil law and religious law at that time. So you're talking about, how does the law of God apply to me? What does this mean? Okay, I'm not to do this, but, well, I'll use it this way. I'm supposed to love my neighbor, but who's my neighbor? These are the guys that you would go to get an explanation of how that applies and what that means. They'd come from Jerusalem. They saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. And so it qualifies what it means by defiled. They had a tradition that said if you didn't wash your hands, then your hands were undefiled. So if you ate with undefiled hands, then what did that mean? Your hands are dirty, and you ate with dirty hands, so now your food is dirty, and you've consumed this defiled food, and that means what? That you're defiled. So we've got all this built up around. And by the way, this is part of the process, okay? There's ritual cleansings and stuff that were set forth in the law, and so they determined, hey, if you don't wash and go through this process and cleanse yourself before you eat, then you defile yourself by eating. So listen to what happens here. It says they ate with defiled, that is, unwashed hands, for the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. Listen, don't misunderstand the point here. This is not saying, hey, don't worry about washing your hands. This is not a health issue. This is not cleaning your hands because you've been out working with the animals and you need to wash the dirt off your hands. This is ritualistic cleansing that they believed was a part of following God in order to maintain their purity. And so that's what they taught. They had all these traditions, and they followed them. They followed them carefully. The Pharisees and the scribes asked him, why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? He said to them, well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites. What's a hypocrite? Okay, that's the functional working definition of it. It's actually a transliterated word. It's a Greek term that's basically just been anglicized for our Bibles. That's one of the things that's kind of frustrating to me when they do that with certain words. Listen, it's just an actor. That's what we're talking about when we talk about hypocrites, people that are playing a role. And so they're making a play about Thomas Jefferson, and someone is chosen to play Thomas Jefferson. And he gets up and he speaks as Thomas Jefferson and presents himself as Thomas Jefferson. But is he Thomas Jefferson? No. He's play acting. That's what a hypocrite is. Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites. As it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Now, there's several things to talk about with regard to this, and we could parse it out and deal with them individually, but there's a bigger point that's being made here. And that bigger point that's being made here is that in order for the external things to matter, what has to be true? Your heart has to be right. The thing that made them hypocrites was that they were speaking the words that honored God, but their heart was far away from Him. It was a show for them. They were speaking these words to make an impact on the people around them so that people around them saw them as righteous and godly. Not because they were righteous and godly, not because their heart had been transformed. They were playing a role, but their heart was still with themselves. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men. And listen, I'm not so sure that everything they were doing didn't fall underneath things that were commanded of God. What made it no longer the commandment of God and instead the tradition of man? Their heart. And that's the part of this I think that we need to understand. We're not just talking about the fact that God has given us ways in which we are to express our adoration of Him, and we try very carefully to follow all that. And we can fall into the same category of the Pharisees if we're not careful by doing that. Okay, we've identified 5 acts of worship, and we're careful to do them and to do them to the best of our ability as they're described in the Bible. And because we don't do this and we don't do that and we don't do this other thing that other people do, then we say to ourselves, what? We got it right. But the fact of the matter is, we may not have it right if our heart is far from God. It may just simply be a tradition of our own that we have adopted to ourselves and we practice because that's what we do, rather than actual devotion to God. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of man. Even things that might be in keeping with the commands of God become human traditions when they're done for human reasons. He said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, now I want you to notice his example here. Moses said, honor your father and your mother. Okay, so that's a direct quote, right? Comes right out of the law. Honor your father. And he said, whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. Okay, so what the law prescribed was that if I disrespect my father and my mother, what happened? And how? I was stoned. But you say, if a man tells his father or mother, whatever you would have gained from me is Corban, that is given to God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father and mother, thus making void the word of God by your traditions that you have handed down, and many such things you do. Okay, so the law said that you need to honor father and mother. The law also said you need to do what? Honor God, to give to God. So you got a law that says honor God, you got a law that says honor father and mother, and he says what you've done is you've taken this honor father and mother thing, and you said, you know what? What I would have given to you, I gave to God. And so let's make it modern. We are commanded to lay by and store up on the first day of the week, right? And that is a free will exercise. We decide what we wish to lay aside. But we have that commandment. And then we also still have the commandment to do what? Honor our father and our mother. Which the scriptures make very clear involves also what? Supporting them if they need it. Paying them back is how it's put in one place for what they've done for us. Yes, ma'am. And to some extent they can be, but we can be as well. And that's what I want us to do here this morning is talk about how this affects me. So here's the deal. I've got an obligation to lay by and store on the first day of the week, and I've got an obligation to help my parents if they need help. And I go to my mom and I say, Mom, I'd really like to help you, but I gave everything at the assembly Sunday, and I don't have anything left to give you. And God says, what about that in this text? And that's not the way it works. When you start applying things that way, then, as he put it here, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and many such things you do. And his point is what? We do this with a lot of different things. where we excuse ourselves. Okay, we have obligations to God, and we have obligations in the local church, and we have obligations in our homes. Do I get to not fulfill my obligations to God, my personal obligations to God, because I'm doing things in the congregation? Do I get to not worry about my obligations at home because I give myself to the Lord and to His church? Listen, elders and preachers can get guilty of this really, really quick, real quick, where we convince ourselves that, you know what, we're doing the Lord's work, so it's okay that I'm never home. I have a good excuse for not fulfilling my obligations as a father as I ought to, because I'm tending to work that I'm obligated to do to God. Many such things you do, he said. What do we have to do with all of this stuff? Not create our traditions about how we want to act, but do what? Actually do what God says, which involves me figuring out a way to do all of what God says, and to do it earnestly from the heart. So listen to what he goes on to explain. He called the people to him. So now the Pharisees are the ones who've come to him with this question, and he deals with it directly from them. Then he calls all the people around to him. And he says, hear me, all of you, and understand, there's nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him, but the things that come out of a person are what defile him. Now I want to stop here for a moment and make this point. I don't think that this is an absolute statement. I don't think that he is trying to say that there is absolutely nothing physical that can defile you. Else we have problems with adultery and fornication and all sorts of things. That's not his point. His point is to teach through a figure of speech. He's making a statement that we would call a hyperbole. He's overstating his case to make a point. The point being what? That defilement actually rises up from within me, not from outside of me. Yes.
We either let it in or we don't. And he might also be referring to any situation.
Yep. I mean, we need to understand that what we really need to be concerned about is that which is within us, not that which is around us. Now, does that mean we don't worry about the things that are around us? No. But that means that the primary concern is to get our heart right. Because if our heart's not right, what we do doesn't matter. When he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable, and he said to them, then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into the person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled? Okay, so there was all kind of rules about what you could eat, right? And if you handled pork or ate pork, you defiled yourself under the law. He's not saying it's okay to eat pork, but he's saying, look, it doesn't matter. That actually was a commandment that was given to teach a much more important principle about the heart. Because what happens when you eat a piece of bacon? It goes into your stomach, and then it's digested, then it's expelled from your body. But guess what? Our heart stays with it. And we're not talking about that muscle that's pumping blood. We're talking about our spirit, our thoughts, our intents, our purposes, our attitudes, our character. Thus he declared all foods clean. He said, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality. The action of sexual immorality starts with the desire of the heart. sexual immorality, theft. The act of stealing starts with the covetous attitude of my heart, with the lack of love for my neighbor, with the thinking more highly of myself than I ought to think. Because basically we steal things, why? Because we want them. And we think we deserve them. And the person who has them and worked for them and paid for them, well, they don't deserve them. And so it's okay. And we even glorify this in stories like Robin Hood, where as long as you're stealing from the rich and giving it to the poor, then that's okay. Out of the heart of man come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder. Where does murder start? Failing to love your neighbor as yourself. Failing to see them as human. That's how systematic exterminations have taken place. When the government wants its people to systematically exterminate another people, what do? They spend a lot of time in propaganda convincing the other people what? That their enemy is less than human. Hatred, jealousy, envy, all of those attitudes of heart, that's where murder arises from. Is it saying that murder isn't wrong? No, it's not saying that. It's saying that it begins to be wrong long before it's acted on. When you hate, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All of these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. And so it's great that I haven't walked up and hit Patrick in the nose this morning. But if I don't appreciate Patrick and love Patrick and care for Patrick and think to myself, okay, we're going to make some application here. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 23, 24, 25 says that we come together and that there's a goal for our coming together. What's that overall goal? To stimulate one another to love and good deeds. And that in order to accomplish that, I have to do what? To consider those around me. Consider one another, how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds. Don't forsake the assembling of yourself together. That's the progression through those verses in Hebrews chapter 10. And so here we are assembled here. And what I ought to be doing is considering the people around me and thinking to myself, okay, what can I do and say to stimulate them toward love and good deeds? To help make them a better reflection of the character of God. How can I act and behave to help them? Just because I hadn't hit him in the nose doesn't mean that I've met my obligation. If I hadn't thought about him and thought about how I might address him and engage with him to help him better reflect the righteousness of God. And by the way, I could be talking about anybody. He was just looking at me. Then I'm not where I ought to be within myself. Now, by the way, if I'm not where I ought to be within myself, if my heart is not right, if I'm not looking at him as a living, breathing individual made in the image of God with an eternal soul that is going to answer to God one day and deal with eternity, if I'm looking at him as being less important or less than human, or if I'm jealous or envious or hateful toward him, spiteful toward him, if I harbor those feelings in my heart, what is eventually going to happen? It's going to be manifested in the way that I speak to him or I treat him. So that's eventually what comes out, but it starts in my heart. And what the Pharisees were thinking is, hey, as long as I don't do anything wrong. And as long as I do what is right, then I'm okay. And he says, no, you've neglected the weightier matters. The real point of the law, which is to get you to love justice and righteousness and to care about and serve. You're ignoring those things. And you've turned religion into simply human tradition that you hand down from generation to generation to generation. And Paul talks about that a little bit, right? He talks about the fact that he himself was a Pharisee and that he came from Pharisees. That is to say, his parents were Pharisees, right? And he had inherited his traditions from his parents, his religious traditions. And he was very zealous. But where was his heart? I thought I needed to do many things contrary to Christ. That's where his heart was. We need to be careful to make sure that these things aren't describing me, that I'm not just doing this because this is what I've been taught and I've received this instruction and inherited this faith from other people, and we do it this way. I need to make sure that I'm here not because I'm trying to avoid being chastised for failure to attend, but that I'm here because I am adamant about what? Approaching God. I'm adamant about offering worship. I'm adamant about stimulating my brethren to do the same, raising the level of devotion to God in my own heart, in the heart of the people around me. Otherwise, I'm not doing anything different. Otherwise, I'm simply a hypocrite. All of these evil things come from within and they defile the person. My sin comes from where? My heart. My sin doesn't come from you. My sin comes from my heart. So I'm going to pick on Leo since he's sitting back there. If Leo walks up to me and hits me in the nose, if I hit him back, where'd that arise from? It arose from my heart. Now, I'll justify myself and say, well, he hit me first. But the fact of the matter is, if I'm unwilling to strike him because I love him, it doesn't really matter what he does to me. Yes, ma'am. Now, there's a whole other lesson to be taught on self-defense and our right to defend ourselves and our family, and we won't get into that today. But we're talking about our hearts, and we're talking about where our activity arises from. If I say nasty words to you, it's not just because you said nasty words to me. I convince myself of that. But the truth of the matter is I say them because my heart is not right. And it comes from within my own heart. So when I sin, I don't get to blame other people. When I sin, whose fault is it? It's mine. And by the way, that's really what God was trying to get Cain to see, right? Look, Cain, all you have to do is do what's right. Why is your countenance fallen? All you have to do is do what's right. If you don't, then sin is crouching at the door and it will master you. And Cain, instead of going, you know what, this isn't about what my brother has done and the fact that my brother is acceptable to God, this is about me not being acceptable to God. So I need to change me so that I'll be acceptable to him. Cain didn't kill his brother Abel because Abel offered a better sacrifice. Cain killed his brother Abel because Abel's heart wasn't right. I mean, Cain's heart wasn't right. Abel's heart was right. Which is why his sacrifice was better. It's why he did what was right and acceptable to God, because his heart was right. And we live in a time where everything's about explaining away our behavior because of some other reason. It's somebody else's fault. It's society's fault. It's your parents' fault. It's somebody was mean to you, whatever. Listen, it doesn't really matter. When I sin, it's because it comes forth out of my own heart, and that is what defiles me. What defiles me is not that I worship God in a way that's contrary to his teaching. What defiles me is a rebellious heart that doesn't care what God has asked of me. Because that's what leads to me worshiping God, contrary to what he's asked for, right? At the core of the problem is I don't really care what you want, God. I want to do this. And you need to accept it. That's the attitude that doesn't seek to follow God. And that's what defiles a person. I'm about out of time, so I don't want to get into this next section that starts in verse 24. So if the Lord wills, we'll pick up with the Syrophoenician woman in Mark 7 and verse 24 next time. You think about these things, especially as we worship this morning. And then as we leave, and then as we come back and worship again, and then as we leave and go out and live, and then as we come back and worship again. Think about these things, because this is the crux of the matter for all of us.
Wonderful story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love.